Hi everybody, I'm Rebecca from Paper Source, and in this video I'm going to show you how to make resin coasters. I'll show you how to mix the resin, how to pour it into the molds, and also how to add different design elements like photos and paper, flowers and glitter, and inks. So let's get started.
Here's what you'll get with your kit: a set of coaster molds and resin hardener, a set of measuring cups and stir sticks. You should get popsicle sticks. In this case, I'm using a wooden chopstick, which is something you can use as well if you've got extra at home. And finally, you'll get some inks to mix in your resin. Other things you will need are safety equipment. I always use protective gloves. I have a pretty heavy-duty mask here for all my fumey projects that I use as well. I have noticed that this particular resin is pretty odorless, but anytime you're working with chemicals that may have fumes, just always be sure to protect yourself as much as possible and work in a well-ventilated area. You may also want to incorporate other inclusions in your coasters aside from ink. So here's a few examples of what you could use: different maps or wraps, different die cut shapes. I actually cut this out of a piece of wrapping paper. Photos, you can use pressed flowers or plants, or you could throw in some glitter. There's a lot of different things that you can add to your coasters. If you're using paper inclusions of any kind, it's also recommended that you seal them first. There's different ways you can do that with different glues, Mod Podge being one of them, or you can even play around with packing tape. So if you've decided on paper inclusions, you might want to have that as well. One of the things you'll have to contend with resin is air bubbles. So these are two tools that you can use to help eliminate those. This one is a heat tool, which is really effective. You can also use kind of some sort of sharper tool or toothpick to be able to kind of pop or move around bubbles as well. Lastly, you'll want to have something to protect whatever surface you're working on. It's ideal to have something plastic where the resin can't seep through. You could also do a few layers of old grocery bags or something along those lines. The coaster molds come in 3 different shapes. They're made out of silicone that's flexible, so it's really easy to remove your coaster from the mold once it's set. When you're looking at the mold itself, this is actually the top of your coaster and this is the bottom. So if we're to compare here, this is a completed coaster. The ridges are oriented towards the top to kind of hold your drink. So it helps to know when you're creating your coaster that whatever's facing you while you're making it is actually on the bottom of the coaster. When you peel it out, this will be the top. So if you're adding paper inclusions to your coasters, it helps to seal them first. I'm using Mod Podge to seal mine, and I'm gonna simply do 1 coat on the front, and then once it's dry, I'll flip it over and do 1 coat on the back. So here's an example of the butterfly that I coated with the Mod Podge. You can see it dries clear, so there's really no sign of the glue on there. And because it's been coated with that Mod Podge, it'll help prevent the butterfly from getting kind of discoloration as the resin kind of seeps into it. So that's the whole goal with coating and sealing everything ahead of time. So the first step is designing your coaster. You're going to pick which shape you want to do, and then if you want to do inks or if you want to do some sort of inclusion. If you decide to go with inks, you're going to pour all of the resin at once. If you decide to go with an inclusion, you're typically going to pour half of the resin, let it set for 24 hours, and then pour the other half. So it's important to know this before you start mixing so you don't overmix resin that's going to end up going in the garbage. So once you've determined your plan with your coaster, it's time to mix the resin. So there's two bottles that you're gonna have. One is the resin and one is the resin hardener. So it's important to keep these separate until you're ready to use them because they start hardening rather quickly. And you want equal parts of each. So you can use your mixing cups that have measurement marks on them to easily measure out into 1 cup. I find that a single coaster takes roughly 80 to 100 milliliters of a mixed resin. So it's a little awkward to measure out 80, so I'm just gonna measure out 100. So I'll do 50 milliliters of the resin, and then I'll do 50 milliliters of the hardener, and then start blending. One thing you want to avoid with these is getting a lot of air bubbles, so it helps to pour and mix slowly to avoid that. Okay, so I'm going to start with the resin. And again, I'm going to be adding 50 milliliters. Pouring slowly to avoid air bubbles. I'm kind of letting it run down the side a little bit. And there will be some air bubbles, so I'll show you some tricks to helping reduce them after you've mixed your resin. Okay, now I'm ready to add the hardener. So I'm going to seal that cap right away. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and start stirring. Again, you want to go slowly. Sometimes it's hard to be patient, but it'll just help create less air bubbles or fewer air bubbles if you go slowly. What you'll start to see is they kind of swirl together, and sometimes it creates sort of like a milky look to it. And your goal is to get it to the point where it's clear and you don't see that milky swirl anymore. So this means you're probably going to be stirring for a couple minutes. So you just have to be patient with it. Within 2 to 4 minutes, it should be good. So I'm going to kind of come back when I'm done stirring. Okay, so I'm done mixing my resin and resin hardener. It looks a lot clearer now. Once you've mixed this, you have about 30 minutes to work with it before it starts hardening. And then once you've finished that time period, it's about 24 hours to cure. So at this point, if I'm adding inks, I want to throw those in now. I've chosen a few different colors. The white is opaque, and then these other ones are transparent. So I have a yellow and an orange, and I'm just going to shake these up before I use them. And I'm just going to go for kind of a marbled swirl kind of look. And to do that, I'm just going to drip them into the resin and not actually mix them, and let the mixing happen as I pour it into the mold itself. So this is just a moment to have fun and kind of play around with color. If you want it to be a solid color, you can mix it at this point, or you can go ahead and go for the marbled look like I'm doing. Some of these will kind of blend, and some of them will stay separate. I like how the white kind of can break things up, and there you go. I didn't have the, you have to snip the end of the nozzle with scissors to let that out, and I forgot to do that on that one. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and pour. I've put this on a piece of cardboard, this coaster, so that if I want to move it around, I can keep it stable. So I'm going to go ahead and slowly pour Remember, moving slowly is good with the resin so that you get as few air bubbles as possible. And I'm pouring this all at once. So I'm filling the entire mold. So I want to go up to the top edge. And you can see it's kind of doing its own thing. The colors are kind of radiating out as I pour this in. I'm gonna stop and take a look. Can do a little bit more. You want to make sure you let this dry on a level surface, or set on a level surface, so that your coaster is leveled as well. Okay, I think that's pretty full. And so the thing with the kind of swirling effect with the ink is you don't really see many air bubbles, but this is a moment where you want to check for them. And if you do see any air bubbles, you can use a heat tool to help eliminate them. If you hold it about 6 inches away and just kind of heat the surface, you'll see those bubbles pop. You don't want to overdo it with the heat tool because you can kind of burn the bubbles into the resin if you hit it for a really long time. So just like a little bit of time, and then kind of look for them to pop, and then you can stop heating it. So I don't think I really see any bubbles in mine, but I'll just go ahead and show you anyway. So just really simple hitting them with the heat and then letting them pop. And even though I didn't see them, there may be some there that I couldn't quite see. So that was a good safety measure to eliminate them if they're there. And now you're gonna let it sit for 24 hours on a level surface to cure, just in an area where you know it won't be disturbed and you won't have anything kind of falling into it. So now I'm going to plan my next 2 coasters to use inclusions. So for the square, I'm going to go ahead and use this butterfly, which I've already coated with the Mod Podge, so it's ready to be embedded. And then for this one, I'm going to use some pressed flowers. So it's really important that you're not adding anything to the resin that has moisture in it. So these were pressed and dried for about a week. Different flowers require different lengths of time. So you just want to check and make sure they feel really dry before you're adding them into your molds. The other thing you can do, because with inclusions you're going to be adding the resin in 2 parts, is you can consider adding something to the background or doing 2 different colors resin. So for this one, the first thing I did was added a clear coat of resin, then the flower, and then the next day after it dried, the other layer of resin that I added in there had the glitter in it. So just like you can add ink to the resin, you can also add glitter to the resin. So you can kind of see there's 2 different tones here. You could do the same by maybe doing a white background or just play around with different colors. So one of the things I need to do is cut down my flowers here. So I like to just kind of lay it on top of the mold and get an idea of, where I want to place it, what angle. And then once I've figured that out, then I go ahead and trim it down because you don't want anything hanging over the edge. Plus this will be embedded in resin, so I'll need room for a layer on top. So I'm going to have it go almost to this corner here, and I'm just going to cut right there. So I'm just going to kind of mark that with my thumb and cut outside of the mold because I don't want to start spilling things in here that will end up floating around in the resin. Okay, so I cut that down, so that should fit nicely inside. Just a reminder that we're looking at the bottom. The bottom is facing us right now. So when I'm adding these things in, if there's a front and a back to your flower, which this one there kind of isn't, but I think I prefer this side, you want that face down, and this butterfly I'm also going to want to put face down. So I'm going to mix enough resin to fill half of each of these. So basically, 80 to 100 milliliters should do the trick to fill half, and then be able to add the inclusions and let it set until tomorrow. Okay, so I have my resin blended. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this about halfway up. And then I'm going to hit it with the heat tool to eliminate any bubbles, and then I'll go ahead and add my flour here. So again, pouring slowly to reduce the amount of bubbles and letting it flow into the edges and level out. So I'm going to pause there for a minute to let it start filling in and leveling out. I'll just add a smidge more to the center. And now I'm going to go ahead and use the heat tool to help with any bubbles, keeping it about 6 inches away. I'm going to try one more time. I see a couple more bubbles. Okay. If you have tweezers, that can be helpful when you're adding the floral inclusions. So you can put this in right away, or you can wait for the surface to get a little bit more set but still tacky. For the flour, I'm going to go ahead and add it in right away. Just gonna kind of drop it. And I might use my little stir stick here to help kind of nudge it into place as well, because I'd rather not get my tweezers coated in the resin. And then I like to just kind of make sure it's embedded and there's no gaps between the resin and the flour. So once you have that in there, you might see some bubbles form, so you can hit it one more time with the heat tool. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and just let that set, and after 24 hours we'll add the second half. So now I'm going to do my butterfly coaster. I'm going to go ahead and pour in half the resin. With paper, sometimes it wants to move around more or curl a little bit as it's floating in the resin, so it can help to let the resin set a little bit. And get, a little firmer but still tacky before you add the paper. I've definitely put paper straight in there and just did it all at once, so you can experiment. For this one I am going to put in the resin, wait a little bit, and then add the butterfly. But again, pouring slowly, and I can take time to work on some of those air bubbles before the waiting period begins to add the butterfly. And I'm just going to use up everything else I have in here, as long as it doesn't go too deep. I want a little space to add on top of the butterfly. Actually, I think I'll stop there. So I'm going to go ahead and work on the air bubbles. Sometimes when I see an air bubble in there that refuses to budge, I'll take a needle or something sharp and kind of move it to disrupt it from its location, and then hit it with the heat again. Couple over here, little stubborn ones. Okay, so I'm just going to make sure that this is level and let it set for a little bit and come back to it. Okay, so this resin has been sitting for sometime between an hour and a half. So I'm going to go ahead and add the butterfly to it. So I may or may not need these tweezers. I might just drop it in. So again, we want to put this face down. I'm just gonna slowly drop it, and then you can kind of gently tap it just to make sure it's making contact. And I might even use a different tool than these tweezers just to get the antenna. Or I could even use this end, let's see. Just want to make sure that's making contact with the resin below. All right, so now I'm going to let that set until it's hit that 24-hour mark, and then I'll fill in the rest of the resin. Okay, so this one's been setting for 24 hours, so I'm going to go ahead and add the second layer, which is going to be the bottom. And for this one, I'm going to add a little bit of glitter to it. So I've already mixed the resin, and I'm just sprinkling a little bit at a time. It's always better to go gradually because you cannot remove it once it's in there. So I still want this to be a translucent layer, but just adding a little bit of glitter to make it interesting. So I might add just a touch more and then pour. All right, I'm going to go ahead and add this to the mold. Give it a chance to settle. Pour a little bit more. All right, I think that looks good. This one I'm gonna hit with the heat tool, just, it's hard to see any air bubbles, but just in case. All right, and now I'm going to let it cure for 24 hours. So it's been 24 hours that I've been letting this set up. So now I'm going to go ahead and add the second batch of resin. And for this half, I'm going to mix it with the white dye so that there's a white background behind the butterfly. I've already mixed this resin, so now I'm just going to add the color. And we're not going for a swirl look here, so I'll be blending it. Again, try not to stir too quickly because that can create more air bubbles, and we want as few air bubbles as possible. And if you're adding ink like this, you could play around with how translucent or opaque you want this layer to be. I like to add the ink gradually so you can kind of conserve it and use it over multiple uses. And I can kind of adjust the color as I go. I think I'll add a little more. So I'm just trying to make sure there's no swirls left in it, although that might look kind of cool. I'm just gonna go for more of a solid look. I think I'm about there. I could probably go for like a brighter white, but I'm letting this be like slightly milky looking. I think it might look kind of cool that way. All right, so now I'm just gonna go ahead and pour slowly until I get to the top. So we're basically creating a white background to our butterfly. This is the bottom of the coaster. I'm gonna let that kind of distribute. All right. You can see it's a little bit of a swirl still visible, so I probably could have blended that more, but I think it'll still look pretty cool. And now I just let it set for another 24 hours. So once you've let your resin cure for 24 hours, you can go ahead and release your coaster from its mold. So simply peel away. And there you have it. So these are just a few ways that you can design and make resin coasters. I hope you have fun coming up with your own designs and continuing to make more. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you had a lot of fun learning how to make your own resin coasters. We would love to see your creations, so if you're posting to Instagram, please be sure to share with us by hashtagging PaperSource. We'll see you next time.